Welcome, everyone. My name is David Pitt. I'm the chair of the philosophy department, and I'm happy to welcome you here to the Ann Garry and Sharon Bishop Endowed Feminist Lecture Series. Today's panel discussion is being sponsored also by the philosophy department and by the Center for the Study of Genders and Sexualities. Last year, we had planned to have María Lugones come to campus to give a talk, but because of her illness, she couldn't make it. And then unfortunately, in the ensuing year, she passed away. So we thought it would be a good idea to have this discussion of her work and her influence on specifically trans philosophers and trans philosophy. So before I introduce Ann Garry, I will read our land acknowledgement. With great respect, Cal State LA acknowledges the Tongva people as the traditional caretakers of Tovangar, the Tongva world, including the Los Angeles Basin, South Channel Islands, San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys, and portions of Orange, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties. Cal State LA is located within these lands. As an institution located on unceded Tongva land, we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives and relations past, present, and emerging. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Ann Garry.
Hello, I'm Ann Garry. My colleague Sharon Bishop and I, Sharon is here incognito, not under her own name, but she is here. Sharon Bishop and I endowed this lecture series when we retired, and we usually have a lecture by a woman of color, but this year Talia had this great idea, and it was all her idea, so she deserves all of the applause, to have a panel, since it was going to be on Zoom, and invited these really interesting people, and it's going to be very cutting edge, and everybody's going to be very happy. And so now I would like to introduce my colleague of 20 years, Talia Bettcher, who's going to introduce everybody else.
Thank you, I appreciate that. First I'd like to introduce PJ DiPietro. PJ works at the intersection of decolonial feminisms, women of color thinking, Latinx studies, and trans studies. They are assistant professor and graduate studies director in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at Syracuse University, New York. With a transdisciplinary approach, they engage anthropology, human geography, and philosophy. They are one of the co-editors of Speaking Face to Face, the Visionary Philosophy of María Lugones, 2019, and the single author manuscript will be published under the title Sideways Selves, the Decolonizing Politics of Trans Matter across the Americas, and I, for one, cannot wait until that comes out. They collaborate with various organizations committed to social justice, including the Democratizing Knowledge Collective, the Association for Hoteria Arts, Activism and Scholarship, the Decolonial Philosophy Collaborative, REC Latin America, and Travesti Collectives Damas de Hierro and Futuro Generico. Second, I'm pleased to introduce Hil Malatino, whom I've only met recently, and I'm really glad that to meet him, and I can't wait to get to talk to him more and get to know him more. Hil Malatino is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and philosophy at Penn State. He's the author of Trans Care, Minnesota 2020, and Queer Embodiment, Monstrosity, Medical Violence, and Intersex Experience, 2019. And his essays have appeared in Hypatia, TSQ, Angelica, Rhizomes, and elsewhere. He's currently working on a book about I want to read this clearly, about being trans and feeling bad. That really resonates, I just got to say. I'm looking forward to that. Finally, Andrea Pitts, they, them, and I've known them for a long time and have had the pleasure of working with them on many different projects. Including a collection of essays in trans philosophy right now that we're working on with Harry Zarn. anyway, I've learned so much from them, and I'm really appreciative of the time and the work that we've had together. Andrea is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. They are the author of Nosotras, Gloria y Enzaldúa, Multiples Agency and Resistance, SUNY 2021, and co-editor with Mariana Ortega and Jose Medina of Theories of the Flesh, Latinx and Latin American Feminisms, Transformation and Resistance, Oxford 2020, and Bjorn Bergson, Examining Race and Colonialism through the Writings of Henri Bergson with Mark Westmoreland, SUNY 2019. So I'm trying to keep track of where we are in terms of time, because I want to do just a little bit of a background, because I think that what's going to happen here is really cool and really exciting, and I think it's, maybe I don't know if it's the first time, but it's really cool and really exciting. And it is charting, I think, new directions that are really worth exploring. And so I sort of want to frame the issues a little bit. I want to begin by sort of saying that, so just make sure I say this right. So the field of trans studies has been around since around the early 90s is when it approximately first began as an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary field. And it was characterized by Susan Stryker and also Sandy Stone as this idea of trans folks as sort of coming to voice and becoming, talking back effectively, talking about our own experiences rather than being the theorized objects of other folks' theories. So fast forward, it's only very recently in the discipline of philosophy that trans issues have really come to any kind of fore at all. Some of us have been working on trans issues for a fairly long time, but it's only recently that there's become sort of critical mass to speak of something like trans philosophy. And one of the things that has happened is as trans philosophy has, gained visibility, it has come under controversy. And unfortunately, the controversy has been the same kind of controversy that can be traced back to the early 1970s in the US specifically, and then also in other Anglo countries like the UK. And I have to say, truthfully, recently there's been a lot of pressure I felt placed on me, and I know that other, trans philosophers may feel the same way, to engage in a conversation that we don't want to have. Engage in a conversation that is old, tired, and not going anywhere. And I've become very interested in, the political work that a philosophy performs in encouraging certain trans folks to defend their existence while erasing other trans folks and completely foreclosing the possibility of actually useful, productive coalition building philosophical conversations. So I think that having a conversation that avoids that one and has a different one that actually engages in, a kind of a new conversation is in and of itself a political gesture of sorts. And that's what I'm excited about today. I very recently saw PJ and Hil on a panel. It was in memory of María Lugones, who passed this summer, as you know. And it struck me. I was like, wow, not only is there critical mass for trans philosophy, there's critical mass for a panel on looking at trans philosophy and the philosophy of María Lugones. And I'm like, holy cow, that is so fantastic. We can actually have that conversation. And I was very, very excited. And I think this is the impression I got when I reached out to these panelists. They seemed also pretty excited too. They're like, yes, we want to have this conversation. And so, we're really looking forward to this. I want to just sort of, again, frame a little bit, where I'm sort of looking at it. And I think that in some ways, the other panelists are even better equipped to sort of like, fill this out. But if you think about the field of trans studies emerging early 90s, they're building up steam a little bit, it's still pretty marginal. It has a kind of underlying theoretical foundation or set of foundations that kind of, got it going. And so when it took off, it was very much connected to and in tension with early queer theory, in particular that of Judith Butler. And there was tensions, there was agreements, and because of that trajectory, the trans studies that developed, the field of trans studies at the outset ended up being very US-centric or very Anglo country-centric, very white-centric, and only sort of recently, not recently, it was more than recently, began to be a little bit dimly aware of other considerations such as race. And even here, though, you see sort of an attempt at inclusion, but it's, a marginal kind of like add and mix, as Sandra Harding would say, and where you don't really get to where you need to go. And there's another strand that I think is, worth bringing out, and I was really encouraged to do this by the other panelists, and that is, from its inception, the field of trans studies has sort of drawn on anthropology and looked at what PJ calls the others. Basically, this idea is you look at other cultures and you look at who are other in those other cultures, so-called gender non-normative or sexually non-normative folks. And then you try to draw comparisons and say, see, homosexuality always existed since the beginning across all, and then we can fight about, no, it was trans people who always existed, and we can find, and we'll have those debates, when of course what needs to be drawn into question is the sort of, colonizing gesture that's being made there to begin with, right? How is it that we're taking up, or that these frameworks are taking up discussions of others and borrowing from it or trying to find themselves in it? And how is the entire enterprise itself built upon a colonial project? And really recently, the literature in trans studies and trans philosophy, I think, is getting really exciting. And I would say, I would just like shout out, C. Riley Snorton's recent book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, really points to ways in which, certainly in the US, ways in which trans is conceived, trans politics, trans identities, trans studies, is really sort of built on a presumed anti-Blackness. And he does an amazing job really sort of like bringing that out. And so today we're going to be looking at trans studies and its relationship to the work of María Lugones. And I think one of her earliest works back in 83 that she co-wrote with Elizabeth Spellman, Have We Got a Theory for You, really put her on the map. But it was in 87, I think it was 87, that Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception came out. Subsequently reprinted in Speaking Face to Face. That really generated a lot of excitement in her work. And in this work, I would say up to the early 2000s, a lot of it's hard to summarize her extraordinarily rich work, but coming from primarily a place of women of color feminism, this richly philosophical and grounded in the everyday philosophy, explored themes of even thinking through how we should understand oppression and resistance. And with that, thinking through very deeply what selves were and what persons were. And finally, asking questions, how is a genuine coalition building possible across multiple oppressions? this work I see is very much in dialogue with the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, from whom Maria draws very much. In 2007, sorry, I should say in 2003, she published her book, Pilgrimages, Peregrinaje, theorizing across multiple oppressions, that pulled together a lot of her early papers. 2007, she published Heterosexualism in the Colonial Modern Gender System. And this was really sort of revolutionary. She sort of begins, what's known as decolonial feminism, right? From really drawing on the decolonial theoretical work being done in Latin America, drawing on folks like Aníbal Quijano, and bringing that into conversation with the concept of intersectionality, so important in women of color feminism in the U.S. And the consequence is extraordinary. I think I've spoken long enough. So the idea is to put trans studies and the profound work of María Lugones into conversation with each other. And to get the panelists going, we sort of imagined 3 themes that we would speak to. One, just sort of talking to why do we think that maybe trans studies needs new frameworks? A second, really trying to think through the relationship between Lugones' early work and trans philosophy, and finally discussing her later work. When we're done, and I'm just going to see what time it is now, I'm imagining we'll probably wrap up around 4:30, at which point we'll be able to go into Q&A. And just to sort of, look forward to that, what we're going to be asking is that people send in their questions to the host, and the host will read out the questions. Anyway, with that in mind, I want to sort of put the first theme in play to our panelists, which is just generally looking at sort of like why possibly we might need new theoretical frameworks for understanding trans philosophy and trans studies. And I'm wondering if anyone wants to go first. And I'm thinking of tossing this to PJ.
Was that an invite for?
Can hear you.
Was that an invite to begin talking about frameworks?
Yes, and I apologize. I sort of was losing steam towards the end. And so I lost the kind of energy, and I was just like, all right, let's hand it off. Yes, please. So let's, I think that, we're probably going to end up talking about lots of different stuff, but if we can sort of start off with talking about frameworks, I think that would be the way to go. Thank you.
So would I go first? Andrea, Hil?
Okay. Yeah, why don't we go PJ, Andrea, and Hil? Does that sound good?
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Talia, and the Department of Philosophy at Cal State University and the Endowed Speaker Series for the invitation. I am right now in central New York, in Syracuse, in the land of the Haudenosaunee people, the part of the Onondaga Nation, stewards of this land for centuries. And is in a way, some of these conversations we've been having, not only here, like Talia said, but in other events. Some of them are more public, some of them are more private. It has been challenging to mourn una compañera, a comrade, a mentor, a friend, who passed in very difficult circumstances for all of us, right? But particularly for a person like María Lugones who yearned for company and spent her last few days in great loneliness because of the pandemic. So in a way, for many of us, these gatherings and ways of getting to see each other who are thinking about her, thinking with her, learning with her, is also a way of mourning and also a way of being with each other in much after the way that she modeled theoretical, practical ways of being with each other. So thank you so much for the invite to the conversation. With respect to the frameworks, I mean, one of the things that is interesting about what I've learned about Maria with respect to, you know, that meta operation about looking at fields, looking at methods, looking at ways of asking questions, looking at ways of following a relationality that is a resistant relationality, moving against multiple oppressions. One of the things that I learned is that her theorizing was indeed practical, but very much embodied. She rejected the idea that is so typical in philosophy of thought experiments. So even her doctoral dissertation was about friendship, right? Not as if, but within the possibilities, the ethical possibilities of friendship. And so now what's interesting then is that it seems to me that one of the things I learned from her is to be cautious of the closures and the erasures that of certain methodological ways of foregrounding subjectivities that move against oppression. So if trans and transing and transness is one of those spaces that move against multiple oppressions, then one of the things that I learned from her was to ask, what is it that trans forecloses? What is it that it forecloses when we are thinking from within gender nonconformity among racialized folks who move against multiple oppressions? So I think that the first idea that I have about frameworks has to do with how do we foreground gender nonconformity under or within the legacy of coloniality without emphasizing trans as part of the legacy of coloniality. And in that sense, I think that we need different, more radical, inclusive, intersectional, and differential frameworks. Frameworks that center the embodied realities, the ways that we dwell in our bodies, think about them, feel with them, and carry out politics, radical politics, because of them. Susan Stryker, Paisley, Curran, and Lisa Moore think about transing and trans as pointing, I'm going to take 3 minutes or so, as pointing to practices that assemble bodily attributes and being into contingent structures, and that among those possibilities, one of those contingent bodily attributes of being can operate within gender territories. Transgender can be one of those. And I take this definition as a working definition that is capacious and speaks to the many lessons that new materialisms have taught us, specifically that the body and subjectivity are ongoingly engaged with becoming and not necessarily with being this way or another way, or being this or that for now and for always. I do think, however, that what still troubles me about this working definition is the tense relation between embodiment and being. And if I can share I think I would need the host to allow me to enable the sharing feature for me. If you can.
I just made you co-host, so you should be able to do it.
So what the concern that I have is this tension between being and beneath the human. Specifically, I'm thinking about embodied experience, histories, and practices. Among those, denied standing as member of the world of being or the genre of the human. I think trans, and I do trans politics from within trans and of color communities, both in the Latinx community in the US, Northern California, and where I live, and the travesti community of the Andes in Argentina, in Bolivia, and Peru. For those of us whose bodies still bear the brunt of the aftermath of colonialism, it is not the almost human or the monstrous that defines our non-typical embodiments. Rather, it is our condition, which is partially exterior to the colonial order of the world. That's what makes our embodiments infrahuman, beneath not only the human, but also beneath the non-human. To make sense of this condition, in 2008, I began to experiment with linguistic responses to coloniality and its imposition of gender-centered metaphysics across women's gender and sexuality studies. By gender-centered metaphysics, I mean that most anything that we can think about gender variance, including transgender, refers back to the binary man or woman. Mainly, my concern or my concerns lie with delinking capitalized gender from, on the one hand, lowercase plural number genders, and on the other, lowercase between quotation marks, plural number genders. Linguistic responses point to the intersubjective negotiation, wherein those, such as myself, who have been placed within what María Lugones defined as the dark side of the colonial modern gender system, actively respond. So it's how, from within what type of embodiments, from within what type of epistemology, from within what type of ontologies, we respond to the heterosexualizing of embodied differences. So let me look at the three distinctions that I introduced. Capitalized gender allocutions such as man or woman, they mark coloniality. Sorry about I think allocutions should be in the plural, right? So such as man or woman mark, not marks, mark coloniality's primary bodily dichotomy within the domain of the human. Lowercase plural number genders allocutions, men, women, mark the always already unattainable status of men or women. That is, even if we seek to embody masculinities and femininities, they are always already unattainable. This is the reason why the term female masculinity, as coined by Jack Halberstam, perpetuates coloniality. Finally, lowercase plural number between quotes genders allocutions pertain to the always already unassimilable domain of embodied differences who remain and germinate as neither man nor woman, living betwixt and between not quiet human animal and non-human animal. So when I say the term travesti from the Andes, I am referring to travestis who may share, between quotation marks, they may share some of the life struggles that trans of color sex workers do in the United States. But the allocution travesti marks the unassimilable condition of living betwixt and between not quite human and non-human animal. And therefore, that's why I believe that we need to problematize the available frameworks. And of course, part of this, you see part of this, this way of thinking about the capitalized gender, the plural number, lowercase gender, and the plural number, lowercase between quotation marks genders, has something, has some affinity to what María Lugones was thinking about from within the dark side of the modern colonial gender system, in terms of those who are placed in the dark side and those who are placed in the light side. But maybe some of what the new materialisms can do in conversation with that work is to bring a more molecular understanding of the many nuances between the dark and the light side of the system. So let me leave it there for now. Thank you so much, and let me stop sharing this if I can. Yeah.
Thanks so much, PJ.
Gracias, PJ. Hola a todos, todas y todos en Aviala. Also, many thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. Thanks to Talia and Sharon Bishop also, and to my co-panelists, and to everyone for being in the audience. I've seen a lot of familiar names, so I'm really happy to see folks, so thanks for being here. So I'm coming to you today from Catawba territory in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and I'm honored to be part of this panel and in this conversation. And I've known the co-panelists my co-panelists here in different capacities at different times, and it's really just an honor to be in this dialogue with you all. So I also have some notes here. So I'm just gonna work through just this first thematic on why trans studies needs better frameworks, which was the prompt. So I want to actually begin with a white trans theorist, Dean Spade, and mention something within his work that really spoke to me early on in thinking about theoretical engagements with trans issues. Specifically, his essay, Mutilating Gender, addressed the complexity and the challenges of the idea of linearity and institutionalization of trans narratives. He wasn't only critiquing transness as a pathology, but also the demands for coherence or a kind of coherent singularity or uniquely gendered trajectories that could explain something like trans existence, with medical narratives being one of those types of trans narratives. So for example, his remark that in response to the question of a counselor that he was in dialogue with in LA was that the counselor asked, "When did you first know you were different?" And his response is that I knew I was poor and on welfare, and that was different from lots of kids at school. And that he realized that he wasn't adequately offering a kind of exceptionalist gender narrative to qualify for top surgery in the case in which he's describing in that piece, but he wasn't giving an exceptionalist type of gender narrative to account for his gender identity that would be separable from his class, race, family, and political relationships. And I found that idea really powerful, that whatever forms of life that are trying to fit within a trans narrative or not, that they have never been solely about some uniquely separable aspect of gendered being, embodiment, or institutions, as though they were somehow able to be teased apart from institutions, embodiment, and being / becoming of race, ethnicity, and class. So this is I think for a lot of theorists now that some folks have already mentioned, like C. Riley Snorton, Coley Driscoll, Eli Clare, and Francisco Galarte, they're exploring, what is the depth and the breadth of that kind of inseparability. And I think one of the insights that is maybe loosely shared by a number of these theorists who are exploring those issues, including my co-panelists here, are that the conscripts of modernity and neoliberal rights through which gender and transness are understood, recognized, and sensationalized are as anti-Black, settler colonialist, ableist, and deathly for Black, Brown, Native, and disabled peoples as they are liberatory for people who benefit from them. So they have that. And I think this is also just to look towards some of the later work in Lugones thinking about this light dark side relationship. and that any trans narrative that somehow misses or relegates these facets of existence to an outer or intersecting boundary of gendered experience won't do justice to the everyday realness in which worlds of Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color exist, whether trans or not. But what I think is also of equal importance in all the people that I just mentioned, and my co-panelists here, is that none of that deathliness and devastation totalizes experiential worlds of meaning, sense, joy, erotics, and love. And I know we'll talk about María Lugones' work in just a moment. And I think it's important to resist the idea that differing forms of oppressions are like, you know, the piling on of blankets that somehow smother without creating openings or nooks or liminal spaces. But this negative view, I think, forecloses this negative view of oppression as totalizing, forecloses the transformative ways in which there have been, are, and will be spaces in which communities of color, trans, two-spirit, gender variant or not, places in which we find ourselves affirmed, caressed, understood, and loved. Worlds where we plan and strategize and roll our eyes and laugh and fuck and share stories and all that stuff. So I think, of course, with that idea of these non-totalized worlds, there is also something like a danger of romanticization. And I think, of course, that's possible, including, you know, something like settler longings for a pre-colonial, pre-capitalist, or pre-political utopia in which all things flourish. But I don't think that that move towards liberatory worlds needs to be merely an exercise in affirming belonging within a settler nation state or recognition within a white aspirational literary or historical imagination. I think it's more, and this is then looking towards the work of Lugones, I think it's more like a social ontology. And maybe this is also just thinking through what PJ just was describing, a social ontology that's clearly complicated, but that enriches, expands, and challenges configurations of agency, freedom, and time in particular. And so this is where I think a lot of exciting work is being done. And I believe, you know, the activists and writers like those on this panel, like those in the audience, are already doing some of that work. So I think that's just one of my framings for the question ahead.
Thank you.
All right. So, hey all, thanks so much for spending your Friday evenings or afternoons or whatever time of day it is, or day it is where you happen to be located. I am currently, I'm at Penn State. I'm in a little village right outside of the university called Pine Grove Mills. Penn State is a massive land-grant institution, and that means that the land that Penn State calls its own now, the land that it has taken, is actually from 112 different tribes. So if I named all of them, we'd be here all night. But some of those, right, lands were taken from the Yakima, the Menominee, the Apache, and the Cheyenne Arapaho. So to name a few, some of many. And so it's hard for me to talk about Maria's work without talking about my encounters with Maria, because she was my advisor, she was a friend, she was a deep mentor to me. And I also learned to, well, what do I want to say? I both approached transition personally and encountered trans studies in dialogue with both her and her scholarship. So it's meant that my engagement with trans studies over the last 15 years has always been with some kind of investment in Maria's account of the modern colonial gender system. And that's informed my entire reading and understanding of the consolidation of trans studies. But given that, it was a particular challenge to think about how to open this conversation with you all tonight, because I felt like simultaneously there was so much I wanted to say, and wasn't sure necessarily how to approach it because, I don't know, Maria's work is such a big part of my thinking. But where I want to start, I suppose, is in thinking about the function of whiteness in the consolidation of trans studies. And Talia has already, I mean, everybody actually has already hit on this, but Maria wasn't particularly into trans studies as a discipline. And when I was demonstrating interest in it as a young graduate student, Maria was just like, nah, it's not that exciting. And I think it's important to note why it was, right, that she didn't find it that exciting. And preparing for today, I went and read her most recent published work, which is a 2020 essay in the journal Critical Philosophy of Race that was actually in a special issue dedicated to Lugones' work. And I just want to read the short paragraph that I think does a great job of summarizing Maria's disenchantment and sort of disinvestment with the consolidation of trans studies as a field, and also more broadly like white Anglo queer theory as it has informed at least some of trans studies. So bear with me for 1 second. Just going to pull it up. So she writes in this essay, and it's called Gender and Universality in Colonial Methodology. She writes, new thinking about gender has accompanied the critique of the binary, provoked by focusing on intersexuality, transgender, transsexuality, and the introduction of queer as a non-binary understanding of gender. Yet, the critique of the binary has not been accompanied by an unveiling of the relation between colonization, race, and gender, nor by an analysis of gender as a colonial introduction of control of the humanity of the colonized, nor by an understanding that gender obscures rather than uncovers the organization of life among the colonized. The critique has favored thinking of more sexes and genders than two, yet it has not abandoned the universality of gender arrangements. So, given the critique of the binary, one can think of gender as the socialization of reconceived sexual differences, remembering that not all sexual differences have been unambiguously socialized. So, there's a lot going on in this paragraph, but two things I want to bear out, which I think are central to the project of trans studies historically and currently. One is that the sort of multiplicative logic of gender that has informed much of how transgender has been articulated over and against medical models of transsexuality is still invested in a colonial modern logic of gender, because it still is articulated with recourse to the sort of white bourgeois binary of gender, even as it multiplies gender options beyond it. So there's that. And then also there's this implicit understanding of transsexuality that Maria has, and I think it's articulated at the end of this paragraph that I read, that basically understands it as a reorganization of white bourgeois models of sexual difference or understandings of sexual difference. And that's, that's a pretty disenchanted relationship to iterations of transness that circulated and consolidated trans studies. And the other, so I want to mention that at the outset and then say that with this in mind and with Maria's sort of disenchantment with the project of trans studies informing my engagements with it, I thought, how do I do work in trans studies as a white academic in a way that's responsive to Maria's work, right, and the theoretical and epistemological underpinnings and political interventions of that work. And it's tricky, right, to do that. And the first means through which I approached that was provincializing trans studies to begin with, like considering the consolidation of that field as specifically invested in white Eurocentric gender norms, right, even as it reworked them, even as it troubled them, problematized them, aimed to subvert them. And then the other way that I've tried to think about Maria's work in relation to trans studies is being sort of always skeptical of the way that the specter and spectacle of trans women of color comes to operate in trans studies. So there's this sort of knee-jerk move that a lot of theorists in trans studies make, and I would count myself among them at certain moments, to call attention to the sort of necropolitical violence that trans women of color, and particularly Black trans women, experience. It happens in almost every essay I can think of when trans women of color enter the picture, right? It's always through the sort of emphasis on violence, on questions of genocide, homicide, murder, suicidality, etc. And that move has become a form of virtue signaling, I think, amongst white trans academics and white academics who do trans studies, to say, hey, I'm thinking about race, I'm like incorporating race in my analysis. And it's the most, right, it's so, right, just pale, and it's not a way of actually thinking about race, it's a way of actually avoiding thinking about the complexities of race. So yeah, I wanted to call attention to those two sort of phenomenon, right? The necessity to provincialize trans studies, and then also to think about the radically limited ways that the trans folks of color, and specifically Black trans women, enter into theorization that happens in trans studies. And yeah, so for the sake of time, I think I'll just stop there and then see where this conversation goes.
Thanks, Hil. I'm going to keep my comments about this fairly brief, and in some ways, I suppose, just sort of maybe a little bit autobiographical, you know. So I transitioned in the mid-90s, and this is just when sort of like transgender studies was breaking, you know. And so, you know, I got some of this early stuff. I bought like Kate Bornstein's Gender Outlaw and rushed up to get her to sign it and all that kind of thing, you know. And what it was to me, it was so weird because I knew the whole sort of old transsexual model, and I knew I didn't like that. But also this new stuff, I thought it was pretty cool, but it didn't work either. It didn't seem to like capture real life. And this is for me what was so, for me, leaving grad school, I mean, I stayed in grad school, but I mean, I didn't, my life wasn't in grad school. You know, it was very much in various different communities in trans studies, I mean, in trans communities in LA. And, you know, what was going on there? It seemed to have very little to do with what I was reading about, even in like the new transgender politics stuff, right? Like everything, like so much of like how I learned to accept myself and be, and sort of like not look to this or that to like find validation. You know, I learned, you know, on the streets in Los Angeles with and I will, you know, mainly trans women of color activists who play and continue to play an important role, you know, politically, you know, in Los Angeles-based trans politics. And I learned a lot, and I got a lot more out of that than I did the books, and I did these abstract theories. And it just seemed to me that the abstract theories, they didn't fit what was happening on the ground. Certainly they didn't capture the complexities of race, class, sexuality, all that stuff that was just like one thing grouped together happening on the fly in real life. You know, and then the inadequacy of just sort of going like, oh yeah, it's the oppressive binary, felt so hollow that it didn't actually seem to do anything, you know. And my mentor, Jake Hale, who was writing at this time, got me turned on to the work of María Lugones. And so like I started reading, and this was, I mean, I guess this was like 95. I started reading, you know, Playfulness, Loving Perception, you know, While Traveling and Loving Perception. And it wasn't that old at that point, right? I mean, it was like 5 years old maybe. And it was like, this is what's going on. I understand, this makes complete sense, you know, because of, you know, sort of the world traveling that we were doing and the world traveling that I had to do, and how that led to, you know, extraordinary transformation. And so from very early on, I just kind of felt like there's something wrong with the way this is going. It's not, it's abstract, and it's not capturing the concrete realities. Anyway, I'm gonna keep it brief. I'm gonna stop there. So let's now think about, you know, specifically some of the, you know, Maria's earlier work, you know, sort of pre-2007, and put it into a conversation with trans philosophy, trans studies, and so forth, and put it in a way of like, you know, how can there be some cross-fertilization, right? Or how can a trans studies benefit from the work here that Maria is doing? And I want to open it up because I don't want to talk too much. I'm going to hand it off. Can we just keep the same order? Is that all right? Yeah, I'm going to hand it off to PJ.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And it's just amazing to see so many people joining us in this. So I look forward to hearing also what they may want to add to the conversation that we're having here, right? I remember once, I don't know if Hil had a course like this, but there was one course that on gender and sexuality that María Lugones co-taught with Michael James Garcia. at Binghamton University, and I was one of their students. And one of the things they did was to model complex conversation. I mean, going off of the title of the event today. So they would model complex conversation, and then we would kind of replicate different models of complex conversation. So that's, maybe we can see that a little bit later. One of the things, right, about the earliest work that really pulled me toward, you know, what some of us are calling trans of color theorizing, trans of color theory today, is some of the features of the practical thinking in Lugones' work, and particularly her understanding of power as, you know, in that unfolding of oppressing, being oppressed, resistant. So much so that that understanding of power is like, you know, understanding the intersubjectivity materially produced, social materially produced. And then later on, when she started to do work with, you know, the Situationist and the work of Lefebvre and Michel de Certeau, which is part of that, you know, that period that makes it to the introduction of pilgrimages, and then the last chapter on pilgrimages, peregrinajes, on the streetwalkers theorizing. So it becomes like really thick, right? That understanding of the oppressing, being oppressed, resistant. So that it then occurred to me that her affinity to the work of particularly Black, lesbian communities that were pushing against queer theory in the 90s, such as the work of Cohen's and also the work of particularly Evelyn Hammond's in Black Holes, the Geometry. I can never remember the whole title, right? But what the affinity, right, of marking, you know, marking the embodiment of quote unquote women of color, you know, at some point in one of their, you know, in one of the pieces that is like one of those pieces that I guess toward decolonial feminism, or maybe in heterosexualism, I can't remember really, but at some point she says, logically speaking, women of color are not women in that sense. So in that sense, there is already a critique of cis sexism as a structuring of the social, but also as a way through which materially embodiment becomes and unfolds. So one thing also that strikes me really in a very interesting way was to some of her work on intersectionality was a work that truly I mean, thinking like on the edge, right? On the edge of each other, what she used to call each other's battles in the work or the praxis of a women of color coalition building. So that one of the things that I learned from her was to kind of look at subjectivities of people of color as subjectivities that are never quite done by oppression, never quite overdetermined by oppression, to the extent that she could claim then women of color are not women in the sense of the modern colonial gender system. And another sense that she could go, you know, that I think there's a feature that contributes to thinking trans of color theory and politics is that the subject of intersectionality, particularly the earliest subject of intersectionality, because it was born as a theory, as a legal theory about what the justice system could see or could not see, about those who are placed at the intersection of multiple oppressions. One of the things that truly intrigued me about her turn toward embodiment is that in a way, intersectionality seems to be doing the work of asking us to look at embodied possibilities at the same time that from within the law, that is a logical impossibility. So that then the work, the intersectional, has to be reworked if it's going to be within trans studies and if it's going to be within trans of color studies. So it wouldn't, I mean, when we say, okay, we're going to do intersectionality and trans studies, it's like an afterthought. I mean, I agree with kind of like what, Hil and Andrea were also kind of like highlighting. Part of doing that work of rethinking how power operates materially and through the production of embodiment, I think that is kind of key. And then the second thing is about the her realist thesis of pluralism, which is in playfulness, word traveling, and loving perception. And I think it is connected to how she understood, power. And I already mentioned the example of the black holes, like in Hammonds, who claims that in the black hole, the logic of the black hole, you never quite know what's in the black hole, but what you kind of figure it out because of how what you can see behaves. So there's a logic that is kindred to what Horton Spiller calls the vestibular in the logic of the black hole, so that genders, sexualities, embodiments are always already operating from within the orbit of the human, from within the orbit of the coloniality. And if you do not unpack how it affects your understanding of intersectionality, how it affects your understanding of embodiment and of power, then you're very limited as to how we can do the work of decolonizing trans studies. And then there, I don't know if you remember in the chapter in Pilgrimages, the discontinuous passing of the cachapera tortillera from the barrio to the bar to the movement. It's just like a piece that is a critique of the racism in the lesbian movement, even though she was, lesbian separatism was very dear to Lugones' politics. She now presents a critique, an anti-racist critique of the lesbian movement, and at the same time, a critique of the homonationalism of both, the homonationalism in the Latinx community and the homophobia and the queer phobia in the Latinx community. And this is 1998, right? So notions of homonationalism that she's trying to work against, and working against the celebration of the self-fashioning, that is a narrative that is so central for to respond to the criminalization, pathologization of trans embodiments. So in that piece, 1998, I think Puar probably hadn't finished her doctoral degree, right? And Maria introduces homo-nationalism, homonormativity in 1998. But it only takes off in 2007, right? With terrorist assemblages. So those are maybe things that are features in her earlier work that allows me to kind of turn to the type of trans of color theorizing that is a trans of color theorizing, as Talia said, that is very critical of the whitening, right, of a queer theory in the 90s, the postmodern turn, and the celebration of multiplicity, even in the work of new materialists. So I think that's also important to remember. Maybe we can talk about that later. Thank you.
Thanks, PJ.
Thank you, Pejota. Yeah, I think I want to echo also some of the discussion of ontological pluralism. I think that's a really important piece for me in her early work. And I feel a bit like a voyeur for doing this part of it, because one of the earliest works that's given me a lot to think about is her dissertation, is Maria's dissertation. And it's something, and I was hesitant to use that document because I know that the dissertation process can be really horrible for a lot of people, and in particular for folks of color and women and gender variant folks in the academy. And I don't know personally Maria as well as PJ and Hil and other folks in the audience. And so I don't know about her, say, dissertation process, her relationship with her committee members and so on. So I was a little bit hesitant to approach that document because of the kind of vulnerability that is part of that, that's invested in that document, or the possibility of vulnerability through that document. But I was encouraged by Maria herself to continue thinking through some of what was in that piece when I presented a version of a paper that was looking at her dissertation, which is from 1978. I think PJ already mentioned it. It was titled Morality and Personal Relations at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I presented a paper on her dissertation in front of her in the 2018 conference hosted by Emma Velez and Nitz Tuana at Penn State. And Maria was in the audience, and she came up to me afterwards and she thanked me for the paper, which was affirming. But she also said something to me that was really, I think, important for my thinking about particularly that document, about the disciplining that happens in grad school and so on. But she said, I remember her quote was something like that she thanked me for allowing her to be more kind to herself. And that was really important to hear because, you know, of course, that the multiplicity of selves is not simply something that is, you know, always an easy task of kind of thinking through that our relationality to not just previous printed works, but also our, you know, previous actions, previous relationships, previous, you know, in ways of inhabiting the world and so on. So I think that was something that her comment there made me want to think more carefully and work more gently and more earnestly with what she was doing in the dissertation. And so I wanted to take the risk of reading something that I think can be fraught with institutional layers of disciplining, linguistic and stylistic constraints, and written for what I can see is an all-white, all-cis men committee. So I think understanding her dissertation has been, I think, a part of understanding maybe her critical praxis or her philosophical praxis early on. And so what I found really interesting in her dissertation is that we find concerted attention to debates regarding agency early on that I think connect up to the task of coalition building across sites of ambivalence and difference. And I think that's something that key from her early works I think is really important. So her discussion of liberatory syllogisms and the non-totalizing nature of oppression that we see in the early work, like Have We Got a Theory for You with Elizabeth Spelman, or even the structure, anti-structure and agency under oppression, 1990, I think they link up really well with this interesting work in her dissertation. So it's written as a project in moral philosophy, and just add a caveat. I know there's a lot of folks right now who are in programs with strengths in ethics and moral philosophy, and they're also starting to look to some of her work. And I think it shouldn't be a coincidence that maybe this is also maybe to refer to something that PJ said, but like she's doing something like care ethics or an attentiveness to particularity and relationality in 1978, which is before a lot of the white feminist writers get recognized for having done a lot of that work in terms of attentiveness to care and so on. But anyways, I think what's really interesting here is that she's writing about the specificity of friendship within forms of practical reasoning. So as we see in the later published work on liberatory and practical syllogisms and liberatory syllogisms, that's also in her dissertation. But against some of the, and I think what's interesting is, and I don't know this particular, her committee chair's work as much as her work, But from what I can tell, his work was on something on moral generalizations and universalization within ethical theory. So I'm sure folks know more than I do on this from maybe conversations with her, but I would be interested to learn more about that relationship. But it seems like she's pushing against that in some really serious ways by arguing that friendship entails these really unique, caring relationships towards other people, like a particularity and a kind of, it shows up in world traveling, but I think it's also, it's a question about the idea of using categories as forms of generalization or ways of making moral judgments across the use of categories, which of course we're having, those conversations will continue throughout the Decolonial Project and other places. So I think in the dissertation, unlike in cases where one is bound only institutionally or formally in some way, she's looking at intimacy, friendship, and loving relationships in particular. And in those conditions, one need not solely rely on something like moral principles because the ethically relevant considerations at hand are unique to that situation, that person, and that relationship. And so I think the later works are now looking more about what makes context. How does context become meaningful and still with that attention to particularity and relationality, but also how is it that we understand and historical context that we're in, or the various plurality of historical context, cultural context, linguistic context that we might be in. And I think she starts really earnestly breaking that apart in the later, in her first publications and thereafter. But I also want to hesitate because I don't want to make this like a neat linear relationship from her dissertation to the rest of her work. I don't know if that would be the most, I think it might be doing a disservice to try to read like this kind of like, progressive narrative within her writing. So I also want to kind of temper my enthusiasm for these early ideas in her work, but also to try to link it to some things that we see, like the real clear articulation of something like ontological pluralism and the structure anti-structure essay in 1990. And so I think there it's, we see this careful tracking of personal intimate relationalities. We see this and what they mean for developing a social ontology. We see also the similar concern with practical syllogisms. We also see their impossibility within the confines of theories of oppression. And so now at this point in the dissertation, she uses the category like Chicano as an example of a totalizing, a moral generalization that would somehow limit one's relationality to a person. I think actually the person's name is, she gives an example of somebody's name in the dissertation, where she says, oh, how would I relate to this person as both Chicano and that person in particular? And so then by structure and anti-structure in 1990, she's now looking at something like oppression theory being that totalizing framework that would then foreclose a particular type of relationality or resistant kind of praxis for that particular person. Yeah. So she's I think there's something really interesting going on there with that relationship and her then commitment to ontological pluralism by 1990. And then although she's not offered it in this way directly, I think that the claim about ontological pluralism builds from worlds and sense and meaning beyond. I mean, she says it in some words in terms of beyond aspirational whiteness and gender normativity. But she also states that ontological pluralism is suggested vividly by theories of racial oppression, including Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera and Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. So two works that today we know are being read by authors theorizing trans of color experience, including not just C. Riley Norton, but also Marquise Bay, Ana Marina Lara's work, Francisco Galarte, T. Jackie Cuevas, Misha Cardenas, are all in different ways looking at the forms of pluralism and multiple worlds within those texts, for example, specifically for understanding trans experience or gender variant experience. So wow. Then I'll pause there because I think there's a lot more to unpack with respect to then how her suggestions in those early works are then, I think, our openings now where we see a lot of contemporary theorists looking at trans, gender variant, two-spirit, and resistant gender embodiments or in erotic embodiments. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just kind of want to listen to Andrea talk about the dissertation for the rest of the night. Because you're like on fire. You're obviously so like preoccupied with it, and it's amazing. I want to hear more about
We should have water afterwards together.
So, but I will, for the sake of time, I can keep this a little bit short. I wanted to talk about really three of her earlier works: Hard to Handle Anger, which is something that we haven't discussed yet, but I found really resonant, and Playfulness, World Traveling, Loving Perception, then also Structure, Anti-Structure, and Agency Under Oppression. I don't know if I'll get to all of that, but I'm going to start with Hard to Handle Anger since that's one of the ones we haven't talked about yet. And that essay, and I wanted to pull out of that essay to think with in relationship to like Lugones' work in trans studies, is the way that she theorizes really two different kinds of anger in that essay. She talks about anger that makes a claim upon respectability, anger that is meant to resonate in official worlds of sense to sort of get people to take you seriously, and that is directed at authority. And then another form of anger which actually turns away from respectability and is a mode of resistance to anger that has some sort of coalitional possibilities as it circulates amongst multiply marginalized folks and communities. And I'm thinking about this articulation of anger specifically in relationship to one of like the field forming texts in trans studies, which is Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein, which is actually the subtitle is, right, Performing Transgender Rage. And for those of you that are familiar with that essay, it's staged around Susan performing rage at a queer theory conference in California at some point in the early 90s. And in relationship to the conversation we've already had about like the sort of white Anglo queer theoretical roots of early articulations of trans studies or things that have come to be understood as field forming in trans studies, I think about this actually is the first form of anger that Maria discusses, right? An anger that makes a claim within a particular hegemonic space to be taken seriously, to be taken as a credible interlocutor within the space of, in that instance, queer theory. And there's all sorts of stuff about the way that Stryker signifies in the context of that performance that she writes about, where she's visually signaling her embeddedness in the worlds of radical queer activism in the late 80s and early 90s, just through what she's wearing, right? Like queer nation, paraphernalia, etc. But there's a kind of demonstration that's happening there, which is like, I am just as queer, if not more queer, than you folks in this room, this white-dominated queer theoretical space. So you need to start taking the things I have to say about my experience, right, and the theoretical valences and political valences of my experience really seriously. And that's not, I don't say any of that to dismiss that kind of anger, right, but that's only one manifestation of anger if we take Lugones' account seriously. And I started thinking about what instances of transgender rage that actually move away from a politics of respectability, like how those operate. And I've been sort of consistently preoccupied with thinking about an articulation of rage that refuses both respectability politics, but also isn't framed in a way that's like begging folks in specific positions of power to take trans testimonial, trans experience seriously. And I think this goes back to what Talia opened with in terms of like the conversations that some folks in philosophy seem to want trans philosophers to have. And there's a way in which you see sometimes trans rage mobilized as a means of demanding to be taken seriously in the context of conversations about whether trans people really exist or have any like authentic claim to being. And that's, right, one manifestation of anger, but the other one is much more interesting. And at least I think it's much more interesting. And it's because Maria frames the second kind of rage as about both recognizing, and she writes, pushing against this world's walls. And that's where her articulation sort of bleeds into what she says in Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception. Because when Maria uses the word world, she used it in a very, very specific way. And I think it's worth revisiting. And I just want to sort of cite a little bit here. So in Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception, she writes that a world is inhabited by some flesh and blood people at present, right? In order for a world to be a world in the sense she uses, it has to have people in it, first of all. So it's not utopic because utopias don't have people in them because they don't actually exist. And also some people who are dead, and also people that the inhabitants of that world met in some other world and now have in this world in their imagination. So this account of what a world is, what constitutes a world, is really, really imperative, because when envisioning the world in which a particular affect, like say something like rage, makes sense how it's received, how it becomes intelligible, you have to both recognize the operative logic of that epistemology that governs legibility in that world, and then you also have to recognize the limits of that world and understand the imaginaries that are operative in that world and how they're peopled and with what tropologies they're peopled with, or what tropologies are sort of dictating how specific peoples and specific communities are imagined in any given world. So, yeah, I mean, that's trying to think about world traveling with the complexity of each different world in mind, and then think about anger traffics or travels across different worlds of sense has been, I guess, like a long and abiding project of mine. I'm not sure entirely where it's going, but I think there's something there. And I'm not sure exactly what it is yet, but I do think that there's something about a form of trans rage that rejects politics of respectability that can be coalitional if it circulates and is amplified and shared in certain ways that are not sort of always talking back to power. So that's, yeah, one bit I wanted to mention. And then I think the last thing just has to do with, yeah, so she talks in Structure, Anti-Structure, and Agency Under Oppression about how, in order for collective struggle to be possible, folks have to be, you have to understand people as multiplicitous, right? Everyone has to understand one another involved in that struggle as multiplicitous. But then she says, it also necessitates that people become faithful witnesses of themselves. And that's something that's really stuck with me in terms of articulating what something like deep coalition through complex communication is or might be. Because I think part of becoming, in her understanding, part of becoming a faithful witness to yourself is understanding both the ways in which you're in complicity with forms of arrogant oppression, the ways in which you've internalized certain desires to be taken seriously by worlds that might be really anathema to your being, right, or really toxic in relationship to your being, and also the failures of love that inform the way that you interact with other folks and the way that other folks interact with you. And then, right, and just take, so it means actually being kind of harsh in terms of one's perception of oneself, really sort of ruthless in some respects. And that is key to developing any kind of deep political coalition. And it's something I'm thinking in particular about Shreen Roshanovan's work, recent work actually, in that same issue of Critical Philosophy of Race, about the sort of difficulty of deep coalition through complex communication. And just to wrap it up really quick, to go back to my earlier comment about the way that the discussions of race often circulate in the context of trans studies and how they shut down actual complex discussions about race, racialization, and relationship to transness. There's a way in which this move to just reduce race to necropolitical violence that I see over and over again is, I think, something that white theorists do in order to actually avoid doing that rigorous self-critique that is about faithful witnessing or becoming a faithful witness to oneself. So I'll stop there, but yeah.
This is so great. Thank you. And I'm noticing that we don't have nearly enough time. I think we needed like several, I'm sorry, I'm negotiating sun coming into my face very brightly. And try as I may, I'm dealing with it. I'll just deal with it. And we're getting close to a time in which actually we want to allow folks to engage in this conversation and to ask some questions. So I don't think that we're going to be able to go into the third part. And I see some questions there. I think we will go. I think we will go, and we'll take questions in a bit. I just thought I would just put in a few my thoughts on this, and then I think we should just, does the panelists feel okay with that if we just then move into questions and answers? And I just want to make a couple of, again, sort of, I think, simple points. But they're connected, I think, in some ways to the things that PJ, Andrea, and Hil were mentioning. One of the things I think that you certainly, what one sees in, I don't know, mainstream Anglo-trans politics, you know, is this idea of kind of individuality, where gender is the property of the individual. You know, it's my expression, you know, and I think that one of the things that you certainly get from Lugones' work is the importance of relationality. And, you know, from my own work is very much about thinking so-called gender in terms of intimacy and intimacy formations. And really, in some ways, the priority of this relationality, even prior to a fully formed self, as it were, sitting inside a category. And I think, so the other point, I think that, and this is a bit gussy down, but it's been sort of my experience, at least, talking to folks, you know, some who were like, you know, privileged in various different ways, where the thought about resistance is simply you show up and with that kind of resistant power, you get everyone to respect your identity. And you know, if that's where all there were to it, I mean, that's not oppression, really, because if you've got that kind of power, you can intend to do that and bring that reality about. Like, that's missing the point of what it is to not even really be able to, like, you know, pull off a successful intention, you know. And so I think one of the things I've learned from Lugones is how deep and how powerful oppression really is and what resistance looks like. And this idea that resistance is almost invariably invisible to the oppressor. It's not, so it's not about showing up and changing his mind, right? If only you speak loud enough and hard enough, somehow that's going to change things. No. The possibility of resistance is infrapolitical, you know, and that is both the blessing and the curse. But what's important about that is that, you know, and this I think connects to, like, not boxing ourselves into, like, the category of, like, transgender or Chicano, right? I mean, she wants to move away from this oppositional politics of saying, I'm going to confront this person and I'm going to talk to my oppressor, and I'm going to, no, we need to talk to each other across oppressions, as it were, sideways or laterally, right? Sometimes we might fake like we're talking to our oppressors, but that's going to get us nowhere, right? What we need to do is all talk to each other across multiple oppressions, and maybe when we're ready, we can stage a revolution. So I'd like to thank, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to do something. I'm going, very difficult to see, but I'd like to open it up for questions. The way I'd like to do it, though, I think, if we can do this, is if I could have folks simply chat to me, Talia, your questions, either to all the panelists or to one individually, and then I can read them. I can read them out, and we'll take them, and we'll take as many as we can in the time that we have. Okay. Questions. Okay, so we're going to wait. Hang on, I think we got one here. I'm sorry, my computer is not. Hang on. And how do you feel about taking questions? Okay. Before we go into questions, I do want to give a special thanks to the Center for the Study of Genders and Sexualities for co-sponsoring this event and for helping to promote this event. And the center, is a really wonderful center that has been around on campus since around, 2003, 2004. But they do amazing work. So I just wanted to thank you.
I tried to change the chat so that the participants can chat only with host, but I just tested it and it's going to everyone. So yeah, I think between David and me, we can probably handle the questions.
So, but Anne, can't people choose to send their message only to Talia?
Oh, yes.
Well, maybe that's the way to do it then. If
I received it.
Does everybody know how to do that?
PJ, what?
I received a question sent privately to me, so I'm going to copy that and send it to Talia. Yeah, but how do you do that is you click on participants at the bottom of your screen. Once you click on participant, you'll see everybody's name. And what you do is at the very top, there's a search tab, and you write Talia. And once you write Talia, click on that and send Talia. Oh, sorry, you have to do it through the chat, right? Through the chat box. Right, so on the chat box, you click on chat and then send the message only to the person that would be Talia, right? Is that it? That wasn't very clear at all, and we're philosophers here, I know.
No, I think it was. You just go down to the chat and at the very bottom, it says to, right?
Right.
And then there's a list of everybody, so just find Talia's name and to Talia privately, and put your question in there.
Actually,
okay, I'm going to go down. I have this in order, and I think I can do this. Okay.
I just forwarded you a question, Talia.
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to go down in the order that I received them in. I can't see anyone right now, but it's working for me, and I can see the question, so I'm just going to do it that way.
Okay, so I'm gonna send you the one that I received privately. Okay, great.
So here's one question. I'd like to ask the panelists if there are specific concepts from Lugones that they see as being instrumental in helping to alleviate the fact that non-binary issues are often low on the list of trans issues, and how interlocking oppressions like being trans and disabled or non-binary and native add to invisibility. Right? Anyone want to take that?
Hil?
I thought you were going to go. Mine is really, really short, actually, and it's simultaneously a short answer for me, but it's probably one of her most expansive concepts. And it's just her articulation of the light and dark sides of the colonial modern gender system and the way that specifically sexual dimorphism and gender is thought within that system. So I would say, the touch points for that, it's basically everything she wrote from 2010 on, but specifically heterosexualism in the colonial modern gender system and towards the decolonial feminism, are really where that account gets fleshed out. And the reason I think it's helpful is because she lays out both the way that the reduction of biological sex to sexual dimorphism, which doesn't necessarily immediately touch on non-binary anything, but I think it's important for her account, for understanding where she's coming from. The reduction of biological sex and therefore like sexed embodiment to a dimorphic account was instrumental in the consolidation of the colonial modern logics of sex, and thus by extension, because Maria understands gender as the social arrangement of sexual difference. So right, this, and we can talk about that in depth, because that's certainly not the understanding of gender that circulates in most of trans studies, right? And it might not be the idea of gender that many of us think with. But for her, right, she's quite clear about understanding gender as the social arrangement of sexual differences within the light side of the colonial modern gender system. And for her, there's always this investment in sexual dimorphism, which meant by extension, and I don't mean to overstep here, but I think for her, understanding like mid-20th century sexological forms of transsexual embodiment and right, specifically like medical forms of transsexual becoming were just steeped in this logic, right? It was about sort of the imposition of a logic of sexual dimorphism on the bodies of predominantly white, middle-class, upper middle-class trans folks. So if that's the account of the light side of the colonial modern gender system that she has and a suggestion of the way that transness might fit into that, then it's a fully binary understanding of gender that's operative within the light side of the colonial modern gender system. So yeah, it would, I think. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I'll stop there.
Can I add something to that? So the one thing, yeah, one thing that, because she wrote about it, right, even though briefly, she did write about finding herself in her youth in the streets. And she also wrote about going into different forms of exile because of the violence, right? Either queer phobia, homophobia, the sexist violence, both in the patriarchal middle class Argentine household, but also across social institutions, right? So that there was no way for her to be seen as sensical. So that her experience as a street walker, in the sense of hanging out with folks who are considered deviant in so many different ways and different, contexts of life, that seems to me to mark, right, to have an affinity, a disposition to listen to those who are placed in some form of it's not othering, it's like a dehumanizing, right? Dehumanizing of one's sense of agency, of the relations that back up one's agency, so that the trans person feels demoralized, feels not at home, not at ease in one's own body. And then the question that has to do with, well, what happens with folks who are, facing disabilities or neurodivergency or are neurodivergent or also belong to a marginalized, a racially marginalized community. So I mean, one of the things, right, in her work that I find there is not so much how to make, I mean, what is it that we want to make visible? What is it that we need to foreground? Because part of the problem, right, when we look at when we look at the responses, the social movements responses to racism, to sexism, to queer phobia, to transphobia, then the responses still tend to foreground a rehabilitated version of the self. So what does the trans movement want? The right to go, the right to enroll in the army. Is that what do queer people want? The right to go play home. And I know that it comes from rights that we all need, right? But at the same time, that's what we want. Is that what we want? So one of her critiques was, what is it that, on the ground is going to make possible that we work together, as Talia said, across differences? Because sometimes, you go for transgender, as Talia said, and then who are you going to end up with? On what side of the street are you going to end up, right? And I think that's, I get what Hil is saying about about being within the dark side, but then it seems to me that the coalition she's going for, it's very inclusive, right? So she's going to go with trans folks, and then she's going to think about what relationality transness makes possible if it does. And if it doesn't, she's going to unpack it and work on it and transform it through relationality, so that at some point you realize, okay, what is it that we want? The right to enroll in the army and the right to marry, run away. So that's part of, I think, the relationality part that, anyway, so sorry that I talked for so long.
Yeah, I don't want to be part of the army. Go, I'm sorry, go.
Oh, I only wanted to jump in too and just pick up on the thread about disability critique or crip critique or kind of new work being done under disability justice, because I think there's an interesting piece here that I wanted to kind of expand. That there was a quote in the 2020 piece that she did for the Theories of the Flesh volume, which was, I think for me, it was a real pleasure to be able to work with her for that later, very recent piece before she passed. But there was a quote from that text that I thought was really interesting, and this, I think, picks up on what you were just suggesting, PJ, where she writes, and she's responding to Rita Segato's work in that piece. And for those who may not be familiar, Segato is an Argentine-Brazilian anthropologist who works quite a bit with on issues of anti-Indigenous gender violence across Abya Yala. But she's bringing up a lot of interesting things about kind of pushing, critiquing, but moving, also looking at this gender as a category of analysis in Segato and in her own work. But she has this line where she kind of is now saying, well, here's what I'm trying to do. And I think it would be interesting if, you know, I know that she was working on a book at the end of her life. And so she also says this is what she's working on in the book. She says, this is the quote, "I want to stay in the uncertainty of not having a name for what I want to point to reject the sense that I know what it is that I cannot name, and to avoid singling something out by pointing instead of seeking a larger web of meaning." And with that framing of it really does this interesting work. I think the way that you were just describing it, PJ, about not trying to single out by kind of giving that indexical reference to the group that now stands in for the rights, or the group that stands in under deserving of protection within the eyes of the state, or inclusion within, you know, whatever conscript is the next thing. But I also think with respect to a disability justice lens, there's a lot of work on you know not just queer crip embodiments or erotics, or thinking through the kind of life worlds of disability, mad activism, and so on. But this idea of that there's this kind of set of practices of joy and practices of larger webs of meaning in which disability has been present and part of people's lives for very, very long time. And not just in a negative sense of disability as abject, but disability as a framing for non-normativity, for non-normative embodiments that are then the ways in which people are creating and constellating webs of meaning and relationality from positionalities that have been rendered sometimes abject, but also now, you know, the kind of brilliant imperfection that someone like Eli Clare is describing, or, you know, Leroy Moore's work on disability in hip hop. I mean, there's all kinds of really amazing ways in which that work is being done within disability justice. So I just want to flag that I think that avoiding by singling out and then looking at larger webs of meaning, I think part of also a project within disability justice work that I see has not lots of convergences with her later work, or at least this framing in her later work, and what's being done with some folks today.
Thanks. I'm going to try to pick out some other questions. Okay, so this one, I'm going to quickly answer one that was addressed to me about what are some of the things I learned from trans women of color in accepting myself. Well, I mean, this idea that, you know, you did not need to change your body to be a woman, and be a woman, period, and be centrally absolutely a woman, right? That this had to do with who you were, it had to do with internal work that you did, was something that I learned, and I learned principally from Black trans women, and it was crucial to me personally at the time, and has always stayed with me in terms of my thinking. Okay, so I'm going to go down to a question. I want to know one thing from each panelist from Lugones' later work that is crucial to their own thinking about trans. So why don't we just go in the usual order, make it easy.
Ooh, the usual, the typical order of things. Let's go for it. If we're going to ever be orderly, let's do it now.
Yeah.
Then, you know, the one thing is crucial that I truly, it was kind of like, was, you know, I met Maria on the border between Bolivia and Chile, right? And so Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. And there's this, I come from that tiny state that has this what is it? Okay, it's the border between three countries. And she was together with Joshua Price, they were researching the life and the work of Rodolfo Kusch, whose work they translated together, you know, indigenous and popular thinking in the Americas with an accent on the E. And one thing that is kind of crucial to me in my understanding of gender nonconformity, you know, from the underside, from within, beneath the non-human, is that turn toward both the spiritual and the turn toward non-Western, Aymara, Andean, Afro-diasporic cosmologies. And not cosmologies in that understanding that is an abstract set of beliefs or an anthropological worldview, but rather as underwrites the relationality of selfhood. That seems crucial to me. And I see how her work, you know, her turn, it enabled a type of conversation with the work of Gloria Wecker on the Afro-Surinamese Creole and working class women and the Mati work. So even the term Mati, right? Like I was using that term, the genders in between quotation marks. So Mati would be one of those terms, right? And that either anthropology will seek to reduce to a type of lesbian institution of intimacy and networking. And then if you then travel with the Mati work through the Afro-diasporic practical embodiment of Mati, then you encounter other possibilities that are exterior to or partially exterior to the colonial modern gender system. So that seems to me crucial. And as her encounter with the work of Filomena Miranda, who was who taught her Aymara, the language spoken by about 3 million people in Bolivia and in some other regions of the Andes. And then, right, one day, the very last time I was, we went on a trip together was when there was a panel in her, who was going to they were going to honor her work at the Society of Philosophy and Ethics. What is it called? The Philosophy and Ethics. This is probably
Science, ethics, and social theory?
Yes, professional suicide, right? So that at that panel, right, So we drove there, you know, I went and picked her up from Binghamton and then from Vestal, and then we drove together. And then on the way back, we were negotiating, you know, we were negotiating my transit. You know, it was something that it was tense between us because she wanted to know what parts of our relation were not going to longer be possible, right? In the way in which she had embraced, nurtured, cultivated friendship with Pedro. And so at some point, and it was tense, but it was loving nonetheless. It was always loving. And at some point, we had this understanding that we were a little bit brujitas to each other, a little bit witches to each other. We kind of knew when we needed to call each other. We kind of knew things about each other that it was kind of eerie or spooky. And she then, and I was driving, and then she said to me, you know what, Pedro? If it had been a different time for me, I might have gone for it, she said, right? That is interesting, really, really interesting. And it has to do with this move toward, you know, the plurality of selfhood. You know, I might have gone for it, you know, that turn toward another understanding of the human, right? Of the possibilities of embodiment that are so much present and active and enacted in non-Western cosmologies and practices. Yeah.
Thank you, PJ. Are we all going to answer, or do you want to pause?
I mean, it was a question to all panelists.
Just quickly, also on that note, I was reading Francisco Galarte's new book, which is fantastic. If you haven't picked it up, out in January, give it a big shout out here. He also notes that Sharia Moraga said something very similar, that had it been a different time, who has, you know, Moraga has also been criticized in terms of having some, you know, kind of waging in on the FTM Butch border wars in terms of then, you know, longing for keeping queer is what she calls it. But then she also says something like this, that had it been a different time, I might have also, you know, pursued something like trans identity or something like that. So I found it really interesting, and really there's a sub-dialogue now, I think, among Latinx and Chicana and Latina dialogues about this issue, which is really, I think, exciting. But I just quickly, for me, I think it's the materiality of her conception of pluralism and history. I think she's doing a lot with respect to critiques of historiography that resonate with me, from the subaltern studies stuff that I've read, and the Black studies, Afro-pessimism stuff that I've worked on. And there's like these, you know, very trenchant issues with respect to revisiting history and understanding social formations within a kind of modern colonial worldview. And I think that her project is also one that's committed to the material existence of resistant communities that is now, I think, a kind of like a move, like a part of a way of moving, or a kind of dynamism that's within her work that I find really exciting. And just to refer back to a little bit in this recent work that I was mentioning, the 2020 chapter, she says this thing about, she says, I need to do more than just argue against the falsehood of woman as a universal subject, say subjected to trans-historical, ahistorical patriarchy. So she says that's not enough. She says, I need to gather, this is her quote, gather the ingredients that will help me keep in focus actual people within social, economic, religious, and political histories, within structures of power, in changing historical, conflicting processes of formation and transformation. And for me, that's also this like reminder to the historian or the reader or the interlocutor, or however I'm positioning myself with respect to another and to a task in terms of understanding history or understanding a community in which I'm not part of, and so on, is also to resist that kind of romanticizing of the other, or the others, so to say, which is an interesting move that is different than the kind of lesbian and gay anthropologists who were doing this kind of third gender discourse. Is that I think there's worry in her work sometimes when she's working with Oyerunke Oyewumi or Polygon Allen, that she's doing that kind of romanticized, conception of primitivism. But then there's also these passages like this about conflictual processes of transformation and formation that include the messiness, the types of conflicted positionalities, and so on, that I think that I think are really part of doing historically grounded and contextual work. And for me, that's what's really been so pivotal with what she's offered and left it in her body of scholarship and in her life. So, yeah.
Thanks. Could you post? There was a question about posting the reference.
I'll put it in the chat. Yep.
Great. Thanks. Hil?
I'll be super short. I think it's across her later work, really everything sort of post-heterosexualism in the colonial modern gender system, where she just argues against this phenomenon of assuming gender when going to think about or going to look at or think through various anti-colonial practices of resistance. She points over and over again, and within the anthropological literature more broadly, to just this tendency to assume gender. And she says over and over again in conversations and in her writing that when you go somewhere, when you go to an archive, when you go to a site, when you think through or attempt to think with a community and you assume gender, of course you're going to find it. So how do you actually bracket that? And yeah, I mean, it's hard to practice, I think, especially if you're trained in a feminist tradition where gender is like the analytical crux of what you do. But for her, any sort of decolonial resistant possibilities that might be realized, right, or might be thought through have to bracket gender. And then if you find gender, right, in the research in some iteration or in some way, that's another thing, right? That's something to tarry with. But it's a question to investigate, she says, not something to assume.
I'm worried about time. So I'm just going to say the one thing that really sticks with me about her turn is that once you see it, you can't go back. You're stuck. Once you get the memo, you can't get rid of it. And I'm so sad we've run out of time. I mean, this has been a wonderful discussion, and I know that there are so many questions that have not gotten answered, and I'm just wondering if there's a way in which maybe we can at least screenshot them, David, and maybe some of us, I doubt that we can sit, all of us, we can sit down and answer them out, but like maybe there's a way of getting some of those answers.